Hello, everyone. My name is Zeph, and welcome to the Star Network podcast. Today, we have with us a special guest, Michael-Adenuga, who's the CEO and COO of Akoma Health. Hello, Niyi. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Hi, I'm Niyi, co-founder of Akoma Health, and I'm super excited to be on the Star Network podcast today.
Awesome. Great to have you. So, Niyi, tell us more about Akoma Health. How did it come to be? What is the genesis behind it, and what is it?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll start with what Akoma Health is. Akoma Health is a teletherapy platform connecting individuals looking to learn more about their mental health or receive mental health care from high-quality mental health professionals across Africa. So we're online, we're a web application, so people can access us from wherever they are at whatever point in time that they need to receive mental health care. The story about Akoma Health is really interesting. So I think, like everyone else throughout COVID, I was really struggling. I had started a master's in person, and suddenly I was back online. And I flew back to Lagos. I was at home all day, every day for months on end. And I started struggling, and I started developing trouble with sleeping and things like that. And so for me at that point in time, it was just really hard to know where to go for support. I knew that I needed support, but I just didn't really know where to go. And so I think combining that experience with the experience of my co-founder when we eventually met towards the end of COVID at a house party, and that's a separate story about how I got COVID for the first time. But we met at a house party and we spoke about our respective experiences over the last couple of years, and we realized that this is probably something we should look into a bit more. I think that experience and just speaking to a lot of people, their own struggles as well, people even providing care as well, and where some of those gaps were in terms of finding clients or finding people to provide care to and providing high quality care were just two of the biggest things that convinced us that this is actually something we should invest our time into creating a solution, not just for people like us that needed support at that time, but for other people that we would be needing care in this way.
Awesome. No, thank you for that. And yeah, COVID was definitely a difficult time for everyone. I particularly like stories where I hear that during such a time of adversity, people actually came up with innovation. And so I must applaud you for that. Despite the fact that there was so much going on, so much uncertainty, you and your co-founder were able to identify that there's a gap, particularly for young people. So many people had anxiety. I remember myself when I got COVID for the first time, I was like, apart from my family, I was just like, this is so bad for my mental health. And you'd put on the news, you'd see just negative news, and there's no real tool set to deal with that. But I must say, just in the African context, do you feel that the narrative for therapy is essentially improving? Do you feel that it's advancing? Obviously, in the UK, in the US, therapy is the norm. Everyone is in therapy. But in Nigeria particularly, do you feel that that narrative is improving? Do you feel that with what you're building at Akoma, it's advancing that narrative?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think, of course, we still have a long way to go in terms of how culturally and generally we're speaking about mental health and therapy. But I do think that in the last couple of years, especially as you mentioned throughout COVID and essentially all of us collectively struggling, I think we've made a lot of advancements. I think on the government side in the last year, there have also been advancements in terms of how we're sort of thinking about mental health from a regulatory point of view as well. I think that especially when it comes to key stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, we've received a lot of positive response from, organizations like insurers, for example, looking to embed these solutions into their offerings and bring mental health care to a lot more people. On the employer side as well, we've received a lot of inbound requests from employers looking to figure out how they can support their employees even more with topics like mental health care and how that's correlated with how people are showing up at work. I think on the individual side, I think there's probably a bit of a split where maybe people around our age are probably using the language of mental health, talking about how they're feeling emotionally and mentally openly online. And I think that's a really positive thing to experience. But I think there's probably a bit of a gap in terms of potentially older generations might not necessarily be on the same page in terms of the progress we've made, but they're equally important in this conversation around caring for yourself, caring for others around you, and also just being able to spot when you might need support or when other people around you might also need support.
Yeah, 100%. I like what you said about young people being the ability for us to be vulnerable online. And, you find that a lot on social media where someone has a challenge with something and, they just talk about it or share it on social media. And you find that there's a lot of vulnerability in our generation that maybe the older generation didn't have. They didn't have the right tool sets for that. But sometimes it could also be negative if it's not controlled well. Because as much as there are many people who do love you and want to help you, sometimes sharing publicly on social media, there's no like regulation or tool set, so you just have like advice from different places. But do you feel that today, so with what you're building with Akoma, you spoke about regulation, you spoke about getting young people involved, you spoke about workplace, what other gaps have you identified within this teletherapy space, and how do you feel Akoma is solving that? Like beyond the obvious that there has to be policies in place, what other gaps have you been able to identify, and how can we all contribute to solve that?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest gap is probably around awareness, and not awareness in the sense of I know what mental health challenges are, but more so in the sense of how do I go from this thing I'm experiencing to knowing that this is a mental health challenge, and then going into like looking for care. So they're actually kind of two components of like awareness. And I think how we're solving for that is we're making it, I think in terms of how we package a solution, we always want people to be speaking more about their symptoms. Like, how are you feeling at this point in time? And we use that as really important information and data to get people the right kind of support. So on Akoma Health, we have a large number of therapists and providers available, and they all have expertise in many different areas. So there are people struggling with, challenges at work. There are people struggling with challenges in their relationship. There are people struggling with physical health challenges, even that have these comorbid impacts on their mental health as well. So things like postpartum depression, for example. And so it's getting people is removing the onus on people to do the work of here's how I'm feeling, and here's the mental health challenge that's a consequence of that, into just tell us how you're feeling, just speak openly about how you're feeling, speak in terms of the symptoms you have, and we'll do the heavy lifting in terms of getting you from that place to getting you matched with someone that is qualified to address those challenges, and obviously getting you to a point where you're improving over time.
Yeah, no, thank you. You mentioned quality, like finding quality experts who can actually help people who are going through things. And I think just when you think about therapy in the context of Nigeria, I won't say Africa as a whole because I don't know about other countries, but in Nigeria, when I've spoken to friends who said, oh, I spoke to someone who's a therapist here, and their expectation just wasn't aligned. It just didn't add up, maybe because that expert had a cultural or traditional bias to what they understood as therapy. So they couldn't actually help young people like us to actually navigate. They would just advise from a place of tradition and culture and ageism, etc. So saying you need therapy is one, but finding a quality therapist is another. How is Akoma going through the vetting process to not just ensure that, yes, this person is qualified, maybe from a degree point of view, but even from an emotional intelligence point of view? How can we get people excited about Akoma that you have the best therapist online?
Yeah, and I think that probably two really important steps. I think the first important step, or the first question is thinking about the pool through which you're finding the therapist in the first place. That inherently needs to be a high quality pool to eventually end up with high quality therapists. And so for us, when we're thinking about onboarding, and by the way, we have therapists from other African countries as well, so not just Nigeria, but also countries like Kenya as well. And so when we're approaching these countries, our approach typically is to find professional organizations that essentially house these psychologists, therapists, counselors, coaches, etc. This for us is not the end of our quality checks on these individuals, but it's a positive indication, because those organizations typically will have the framework for ongoing training. They'll have the framework for inviting people to join them, and that for us is a really good positive sign of at least the first layer of quality assurance and people having the right kind of skill set. We go from that stage into what is an assessment. So we look at these individuals' profiles, we make sure they have the right number of years of experience. So things like being professional, empathetic are correlated with how much experience you have, how many different types of clients you've seen. And so we have a minimum of 3 years of experience. But I think the most important step of that review stage isn't just the verification of people's qualifications and the number of years of experience, but what happens in the interview. So in the interviews we have with our providers, and I use providers as a catch-all term for people providing care on Akoma Health, we're not just looking that you have the skills that are required for, let's say, a clinical psychologist in a theoretical or technical sense. We're looking to make sure you have the empathy required to speak to a range of individuals from very different backgrounds. And we sort of test that in different ways. One of the ways we do that is we give them a case study. So we'll give them, let's say, a video and tell us, spot what are the things that this provider might have improved on, in a separate conversation with a client, for example, that they might have. And that's one of the ways in which we sort of test this level of empathy. Can you see what's wrong here and there? I mean, we've seen that's very separate from, do you have the skills or the knowledge that you should have as a professional in this space? I think one really interesting point that you mentioned, mostly about Nigeria, is I think that's something that we discovered as well when we started interviewing a lot of candidates for this kind of position as well. There's a thing that happens where you see so many clients that you sort of lose a bit of that empathy as well, because you're just seeing so many. Yeah. And I think that, for us, that's really important, that our providers still remain that openness to receive information and to really help people from a very unbiased perspective.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Thanks for that. And I like what you said about just the frequency to which the therapist itself is the provider as a human being. And I think sometimes we tend to forget that. And sometimes therapy for them can be mechanical. I mean, the movies on this, I can't remember the name of one where a therapist is just so exhausted, and it's like people don't realize that for the therapy to give you therapy, they themselves need to remember their own human capacity. But let's move on to the aspect of work and organization. So what I saw with Akoma Health is you're very big on helping organizations, Nigerian businesses, startups, etc., to prioritize mental health for their employees, because if the employee's mental health is in top form, then they're going to be the most productive that they can possibly be. They're going to produce best work, and every company wants that. But there's some companies that don't still understand why behind that. They still don't understand why therapy is almost labeled as, this is too personal, and your personal life should be completely separate from your professional life. Do you feel at Akoma, you can even give an example of how you are able to maybe convince a startup business that actually it pretty much goes hand in hand? You spend so much time in the office, so your personal life is pretty much tied into your corporate life. Have you been able to find that balance with corporate organizations so that there's an improvement in therapy?
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. I think when it comes to employers in general, I think experience so far is not such that it's not more so that they think that mental health should be separate from the workplace. It's more so concerns around people who are not qualified having to handle some of these challenges that look like mental health challenges. So a lot of feedback we get from people in HR, for example, is I'm seeing this particular employee today, they're talking about this kind of issue. I obviously want to do my best in providing them with the kind of support that they need, not just to thrive in their personal lives, but obviously to thrive in the workplace. But I don't necessarily feel that I'm equipped to handle this kind of challenge in its entirety. And so I think for us, in terms of the progress we're making with employers, it's kind of in three phases. The first part is having that initial conversation with a decision maker at the company. We'll largely talk through, and every company is different, by the way, in terms of the challenges they're experiencing. And we'll talk through some of the challenges they're having when it comes to managing people. Sometimes it's with tension, sometimes it's with productivity. Sometimes there might have been an event in the company that's had a widespread impact on a large number of employees. And so we talk through what kind of solution makes the most sense for their employees. It could be also providing some managers with the support to be more empathetic as managers as well. And we come about a structure that makes sense for delivering this kind of product and mental health care for the employees. The second stage is the experiential portion, where employees receive Akoma Health, can sign up to Akoma Health and start receiving care. I think this is one of the really important points where we have a very strict wall around what people are experiencing in terms of their therapy and the kind of feedback that we give to employers. So at the onset, we let people know that whatever happened in therapy is extremely private. We're not telling you XYZ employee has done therapy. We're not telling you XYZ employee has done X number of sessions. We're keeping that completely isolated from whatever feedback that we're giving HR or any other decision maker at the company. I think that's a really important point in sort of setting the expectations of what's going on. And I think the final portion is that is a measurable part of what happens after you've done a certain number of sessions, where we're actually asking employees to share feedback with us that we can share with their employers. And we onboarded a company recently, and we had a really strong approval rating from the employees. A lot of them are doing therapy for the very first time. And so even beyond the actual care that we're providing, it's we have the privilege of guiding through experiencing this kind of care that has been out of reach for like the longest time, or they've never experienced before, but they've been interested in exploring. And so that kind of feedback is very helpful because companies, HR, CEOs, whoever, have that measurable impact over time of how people are improving and how that's correlated with output in the company. But obviously on a more qualitative point of view as well, people are telling us, I had a session with a therapist that was extremely open-minded. This is the first time I've been able to share this experience in my life before, and that is a very meaningful point of feedback for us, especially when we're considering the fact that many of these employees have never done therapy before.
Awesome. Thank you, Niyi, for that. So tell us more about Akoma Circles. I saw this on your page and I was wondering what is Akoma Circles about?
Yeah, thank you so much. Akoma Circles is essentially a ongoing community series of events that we host sometimes on our own, but predominantly in collaboration with organizations. It's really an informal way to give people insights into topics around mental health or even therapy itself. We've had many sort of episodes and series that have happened in like the last couple of months. One really popular one was kind of talking about the emotional element of, a family member or a loved one emigrating to another country for job opportunities, work, etc. And I think, we often will talk about the financial elements of that, but we often don't think about what kind of impact that has on the individual that's leaving, but also their family members. In a similar vein, we've had, sessions with investment clubs around financial stress and, the impacts that can have on your relationship as well. And, these have been really well received, and we would typically like to reach out into our community of followers or users, etc., to find out what do you want to learn about, what are you interested in learning about. And this is a different way to approach some of those topics that might come up in therapy, but of course in a more relaxed, informal setting. You can ask questions. It's typically fun, not always as heavy as like what I'm describing. But yeah, it's a fun time. A lot of them are virtual online. But we've had, a number of events in person, especially in the earlier part of the year, and that's something that we're looking forward to doing again.
Yeah, that's amazing. Next one, I'm definitely going to join.
Thank you.
Because I feel people, you hear about, there's a platform that's helping you for therapy, but then people get very nervous about it. They're like, I just don't know where to begin. What are my expectations? So it's a good way to fill out that knowledge gap. But let's go into your position as someone who's now a co-founder. You started this Akoma Health platform. Prior to that, I read your bio. You had your 9-to-5 experience. There's so many people who want to transition from 9 to 5 to building their own businesses. And, there can be a lot of imposter syndrome around it, a lot of anxiety around it. But what has that experience been like for you? Because you actually have an engineering background and you've gone completely different into the therapy space, which is amazing. What has that experience been like for you, especially for someone in the audience who's willing to make that transition and they just don't know where to begin?
Yeah, I think two super important things. I think whenever you're moving into a new space, I think you need to approach it with a lot of humility and just be willing to learn. And I think that we've been super fortunate to have essentially many people really invested in the mission. We have, as I mentioned, we had a large network of clinical psychologists that are informing how we are building Akoma Health. They're providing insights on how we think about onboarding people from a mental health point of view, what sort of information prepares them to speak to a client or an individual, how do we track progress over time, how do we maintain a really high standard of quality when it comes to providing mental health care. And it's not just our providers, but also, other stakeholders, like people on the insurer side, for example, that are informing, what's the best kind of experience for someone, who's coming onto Akoma from our side with a mental health challenge. How can we make this as seamless and as easy for them? So I think there's a pool of knowledge, and I think that if you're open to it, people love to share information, especially when they've spent many, many years working in a certain space. And I think that if you're open and willing to listen, there's so much value in that. I would say the second thing is it's hard. I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone rushing into it. I think what actually makes it a bit easier is having a really strong community of people that can support you. The kind of challenges, there are always challenges, by the way, and I think you can't always predict the kind of challenges you'll have. I think a year ago when we're starting, the challenge was how do we get someone to pay for this? Or how do we get our first customer? And now it's kind of okay, how do we make this even bigger? And what is the best way to reach, the sort of next level. And these are different challenges, and I think that it's really helpful to have a community of people that are supporting you, people that have done this like in the past. So I don't know if I should mention names. I'll do it anyway. But as you mentioned, I was working at Bamboo before I started Akoma Health, and Richmond, who's like the CEO and co-founder of Bamboo, is just someone that I reach out to often. Maybe like potentially even too much, but he's someone that's been really helpful in terms of just helping me through the different phases of this challenge. And he's obviously someone that has a lot of experience in this sense, and like that's kind of the kind of person that I'm really grateful to have. We've spoken about other people that we know that have been helpful, like Michael as well from Stairs, and like actually the whole team from Stairs, by the way. They're people that I know as well. So there are many people that are part of this ecosystem that make working in this sense a lot easier, and they remove a bit of that kind of fear of like, I've jumped off a cliff, how do I fly?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's amazing. And I think the point on community is like very critical. Like with all the different episodes that I've done so far, what I'm getting from the guests is this recurrence in community, why it's very important to have friends, family, but even just people who are doing the same thing to be able to speak to and say, some days I wake up and I'm like, what am I doing? Or two, why am I doing this? You know, I could just be relaxing. Why am I actually doing this? But again, it goes back to this greater sense of like purpose. Like, if not you, then who, right? And if not now, then when, as they say, as cliche as that sounds. But I truly believe that when you have this fire inside of you, you have to do it. And that's essentially what you're doing. So well done. Can you tell us about a challenging situation you faced, whether it's in starting Akoma or the transition to Akoma, and how are you able to navigate that? Because I feel a lot of young people, you know, we hear quote unquote, I won't call it success stories. And although people want to hear about failures and things like that, and there's nothing wrong with it because that's usually the norm, your failure in itself is almost still a success story because you come out of that failure. So can you tell us about a challenging situation and how you're able to navigate that?
Maybe this is not like the best answer, but I think the thing that's coming to mind actually is starting Akoma Health and making that decision to stop working at Bamboo and start Akoma Health. Because I mean, I think, you know, we all have this kind of roadmap for like a career, and, you know, we'll say maybe I'll start a business like sometime in the future, but like it's not necessarily always like this very present thing. You're like, I'm going to do it next year. Do you know what I mean? And so that was not something that was necessarily on my roadmap until I started having those conversations with my co-founder, and we had a lot more conviction around starting it. But I would say that leaving was actually really hard. And I think it was hard for two reasons. One, I really enjoyed my job at Bamboo. And I really enjoyed, and I think just more than anything else, I really enjoyed the relationships that I'd formed with the people that I was working with. And so I think saying that I was leaving, it's kind of stressful because you just never know how that will be received. You know, you obviously don't want to feel like you're abandoning people that, you know, you spent the last year essentially working with and sort of creating plans with. And, you know, maintaining those relationships that mean a lot to me was really important. And I'm so fortunate that went really well. That went really well. And they've been incredibly supportive in sort of helping me on this journey with Akoma Health. I think the second thing is sort of calibrating what risk means. Like as I was saying, like we all have this kind of roadmap for a career or our lives. And starting at Akoma wasn't something I had planned like a year before. I think so for me, in terms of getting comfortable with the sense of risk, like, is this going to work? Am I going to feel like a failure if this doesn't work out? I think for me, I had to have a conversation with myself. And I was working with a coach at this point, by the way, in terms of defining what risk actually means. I think a lot of these things seem a lot more, like, I think once you can get a sense of what risk means to you, like, is it financial risk? How can I address that? Is it career risk? How can I address that? Or is it risk in my relationships with, you know, not just Bamboo, for example, but potentially the impact, you know, having to essentially pour in a lot of my day into starting this thing might have on like my personal relationships as well. I think having very focused considerations of what risk means to you and what that looks like, not just now, but in a year, and the things you can do to address those things that might be risks to you is really important. And I think that really changed my perspective on what it meant to start Akoma Health. So I don't see it as this massive trade-off, as it's easy to start thinking about it's easy to think of it that way when you're like really afraid and like, this is all I'm missing out on because I'm doing this, for example. What if it doesn't work out? And I've kind of framed it more as just an important part of my journey and progress. I can't imagine myself doing any other thing at this moment in time. And so it's really interesting to see what that gap is between now and like, let's say a year ago when I was starting Akoma Health. That being said, obviously do everything with your eyes open.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. No, thanks, Niyi, for that. Like, okay, so I like to finalize with two things. So is there something you want the audience to know about Akoma that you're particularly excited about? It could be something that you are currently building in your product pipeline, if it's something you're willing to share that you want people to know about. And then the last question, I like to define it as tools. Like, what tools would you recommend to our audience that you find helpful in your journey, in your personal life and in your professional life? Just balancing. I feel that, it usually is a struggle for many young people who are trying to navigate just, up-to-date commitments with their family or friends because they're trying to build something, or work is just extremely stressful. It can be very difficult for people to find a balance, but there are avenues. There are people who are doing it. They find a way to figure out, I have this friend commitment, I need to be there for this friend, and I'm still able to produce best work. So yeah, those are my two questions.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think in terms of Akoma Health, I think what I want people to know is access is the most important thing for us. And I think access in two ways is something that we're thinking about a lot. So the first one is simplifying the process of going from like what I was saying, from what you're actually experiencing, talking about that, and getting to finding what is appropriate care for you and who the right person to help you with that care is. And so we released a feature recently, which is a preference survey. What we essentially do is take a bit of information from you around your preferences, around who you want to speak to. Because as many people as there are many preferences around therapists. I want to speak to someone my age. I want to speak to someone that speaks my own language. And we have many options to customize a lot of that. And
in different languages?
In different languages as well, yes. As I mentioned, we have therapists from a range of different countries as well. So we have the flexibility around that as well. And we take information on how people are feeling at that point in time. So this symptoms they're experiencing. And we use this to algorithmically match them to a provider. They can obviously still explore the number of different therapists we have available, but this is a really important point in terms of getting people started and making sure people feel confident about who they're speaking to and making sure they're qualified to address some of the challenges they're having at that point in time. I think something that people can look out to in the second vein of access is just the channels through which you can receive mental health care. So follow us, by the way, online at Akoma Health, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter for like more updates on this. But in the coming months, we'll be rolling a bunch of features that make accessing us a lot easier. So not just signing up on web application, but through other interfaces that people are already using predominantly as part of their day-to-day lives. I think on your second question in terms of tools and in terms of just creating balance between work, life, etc., I think the best piece of advice that I received in the last year is from a dear friend. He's a bit older, so he's definitely wiser. But he just said something really simple that was super profound to me, which was like, schedule time for joy in your day. And it sounds so trivial, but like being really intentional about like, this is a block of time where I'm specifically dedicating to do something that is bringing me joy. It could be scheduling time for a phone call with a friend. It could be going hiking, although I don't know what hike you'll do 1 hour or whatever amount of time, but just being very intentional about that and making sure that you remember yourself and your relationship amidst like, this huge ambition you have for like whatever you're working on is super important. And I think that was just a piece of advice for me that really has sat with me, and that's something that like I'm not always good at doing it, but I always remind myself like how are we getting to joy this week.
Yeah, no, when you said that, I just started smiling hard because I say that to myself a lot. And I don't think it's a quote, but I know that Michelle Obama wrote something very similar in her book about joy. And
maybe he lifted it.
Something around joy. But very similar to you, it has just like stuck with me. It's something that I hold very dearly. She spoke about the concept of joy, and what she did was, if you think about this with life, if you need to go to the airport, you're planning to travel, you're going to schedule in all the necessary activities you need to do that will help you to have a successful trip. If you are preparing for an examination, you're going to know that you need to study. You're essentially scheduling all these different things. But why do we not think about the concept of joy in that same vein? As you've said, you need to be able to plan joy. And so for me, I always go about my week if not from Monday to Friday, I'm just working. On Saturday or Sunday, I must find some sort of joy. And joy doesn't even have to be like strenuous as we think it needs to be. Like, oh, I must go out. Or joy could essentially just be, I have 2 dogs. I want to play with my dogs today. Like literally just like sit down with them, have a glass of wine and read something and the book doesn't have to be serious. It doesn't need to be a self-help book, but for me, that's essentially joy. So I really love that you said that. I was going to ask what your favorite quote is and why, but would you say that that's it? Or do you have one to share? I ask every guest this.
Okay. So in terms of quotes, it's probably, I listen to a lot of music. And so it probably would be song lyrics, which I don't know how that's... but I also like a lot of country music as well. And I think the reason why I like country music is kind of the same reason why I like that quote, where a lot of this songwriting on the surface is really simple, but when you pay attention to them, it's really profound. And so there's this song by a country singer called Miranda Lambert. I can talk about her a lot, by the way. She's one of my favorite singers, country music singers and singers in general. But she has this song called Pursuit of Happiness. And there's like a line that says, I'm paraphrasing, but she's essentially something along the lines of changing tires and changing plans on my pursuit of happiness. And I think the reason why, and that might not be a proper like phrasing, the wording, but I can fact check that later, but it's something along those lines. And I think I like that for 2 main reasons. I think the first one is like we often think that like happiness or whatever goal is sort of unlocked after we make this huge decision in our life, but it's kind of like this constant commitment to this like end result or like end person that we want to be. And I think that we often forget that that actually requires a lot of stamina and like making informed choices informed by, you know, what happiness looks like for you and who you want to be who you need to be to receive that kind of happiness. And I think that is like underrated in terms of when we talk about, you know, the choices that we make that transform our lives. It's not just one choice, but it's actually a series of choices. And that requires a lot of effort and commitment. But I think the second thing that I really like about that is like changing plans and changing tires, in the sense that like these choices we have to make aren't always known in advance and they come in different ways. And so you kind of have to be so committed that you can recognize, like you can still make choices on the fly that are representative of who you want to be, that are aligned with, who you want to be. And you can still like answer those questions in a way that's still true to your end goals, if that makes sense. So like, not to get too theoretical about it, but that's kind of why it stuck with me. And they're just like 2 lines in the song, but like they mean so much.
There's so much meaning behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. That's different. And yeah, that's different for country music. I don't think I've had a guest who said they like country music, but I love the diversity.
Yeah, country music is, I think if you like R&B, I think country music and R&B are kind of adjacent in terms of like their approach, like storytelling. There's so many, like we can have like a long different conversation about it. I'm
going to research her now.
Okay, if you do,
I'll let you know.
Chris Stapleton and Miranda Lambert are 2 of my favorites.
Okay.
If you do listen to Miranda Lambert, I recommend The Weight of These Wings.
Okay.
So it came out in 2016, and it's like the country version of Beyonce's.
Oh wow.
So
is this what they've said? They've actually said this is the country version of.
Oh no, I'm just making that. I'm just making that comparison. It's just easy to explain it that way. In terms of like the themes of the albums, and they came out in the same year as well, so it's easy to make that. Yeah.
Oh, amazing, Niyi, it's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. You've heard about Niyi, about Akoma Health. You have that Instagram handle, so follow them on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And what's your handle for Akoma Health?
At Akoma Health.
At Akoma Health.
Just one word.
Just one word, at Akoma Health. And don't forget to stay tuned on our page at the Standard Oil Pod to get more information on all the different episodes. Don't forget to turn in your notification updates for who our next guest speaker will be. And thank you guys once again for joining us. Bye.